Let's get started with today's presentation. We are pleased to have Dr. Paul Martin with us today to present his workshop, Holding On or Letting Go, Treatment Considerations for Complicated Grief and Differing Attachment Styles. Paul M. Martin is a licensed clinical psychologist and the assistant director of the Center for Grief Recovery. He specializes in individual psychotherapy for those struggling with loss and grief and regularly offers continuing education workshops and case consultation for professionals working with complicated cases of bereavement. Dr. Martin is an adjunct faculty member at both Northwestern University and the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, where he teaches psychology coursework on psychopathology, psychodynamic theory and intervention, developmental psychology, and the psychology of loss, grief, and mourning. He is the author of the book entitled Personal Grief Rituals: Creating Unique Expressions of Loss and Meaningful Acts of Mourning. In today's webinar, Dr. Martin will discuss helping bereaved clients cope with loss, grief, and mourning, which can be both challenging and confusing. He will explore research on the topics of complicated bereavement, attachment theory, and the dual process model of coping with bereavement. He will then address the importance of taking attachment style into consideration when designing treatment plans for bereaved clients and creative ways in which grief therapy can be strengthened by implementing treatment plans that are designed with the client in mind. And with that, I am pleased to turn it over to Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Laura. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me and for inviting me to do this presentation today. Just want to second a lot of what Laura was saying by highlighting the fact that, yeah, I'm going to be talking today about a number of topics that are very near and dear to me. I've thought about them a long time. I find them very interesting. I've read a lot about them. I've written a good amount about them as well. And they end up being real big cornerstones to the work that I do with a lot of my clients, especially those who are coming to see me because of some problem they're having with loss and grief and mourning. So, again, just a real brief overview of what Laura was just talking about. I'm going to begin today by talking about attachment theory. And in addition to that, that's going to be the bulk of what I begin the presentation with. But in addition to me talking about attachment theory, I'll be sharing some thoughts about two additional theories that provide different models of healthy bereavement. And so all three of these ideas together, attachment theory, continuing bonds, and the dual process model of coping with bereavement, they all give us slightly different perspectives on what healthy bereavement looks like. And what naturally follows from that discussion is a conversation about what unhealthy or complicated bereavement can look like. So that's the sort of theoretical basis for a lot of what I'm talking about today. About halfway through, I'll present two case vignettes just to give us just to give us some cases to reference back to throughout the remainder of the presentation, give us a little bit of food for thought in terms of how these theories can help us to do two really important things. To first assess for the unique kind of struggles that some clients deal with when they're struggling with complicated bereavement. And then subsequent to all of that, these case vignettes are going to hopefully serve as good examples for how we can not only assess for complicated bereavement, but how we can then design treatment plans for the clients that we work with based on their unique struggles and in some cases the unique relationship that they are trying to mourn in that moment. And what's built into all of that is a discussion that builds on attachment theory and looks a little bit more specifically at attachment styles. Okay, so let me go ahead and jump in. Let's start by talking about attachment theory, which is a wonderfully rich topic. I'd be happy to talk about attachment theory alone for a couple of hours. But because there's a lot that we're getting at today, I will boil it down to its basics. Um, John Bowlby is often considered to be the father of attachment theory, and it's all born out of a relatively simple observation about human nature, which is that a lot of human behavior involves relational patterns of behavior that are designed to form attachments with others and to quite literally maintain proximity to those individuals who John Bowlby and other attachment theorists would describe as attachment figures. Um, this relational motivation persists throughout life, but it is particularly pronounced early in life among newborns and infants and toddlers because the stakes are so high for them. Their very survival depends on their ability to form those attachments and maintain proximity to their attachment figures. Now, luckily for all of us, we come into life equipped with various behaviors that increase the chance of forming those attachments and maintaining proximity to attachment figures. We don't have to learn these behaviors through experience. All of these behaviors that I'm about to describe fall under the heading of what attachment theorists would call, quite simply, attachment behaviors. And I'm going to talk about three big ones that you hear about a lot in the literature on attachment theory. So the first one is that children intuitively know how to attract other people to them, especially their attachment figures. They don't have to learn how to do this. They are quite talented at smiling, being cute. They make babbling and cooing noises that make us want to drop whatever it is we were doing so that we feel motivated to pick them up and play with them, let them know that they're loved, and so forth. That is a really simple but really lovely example of what we're talking about when we talk about attachment behaviors. The second one that's worth noting is that children are also incredibly adept at creating noxious stimuli, sort of an overly jargon-filled way of saying children don't have to learn how to grab our attention with loud screams and crying noises that pull at our heartstrings. They enter life knowing how to do that. And so there are some instances in which smiling and being cute and playful is what's going to form those attachments and ensure proximity to attachment figures. There are other times in life where it's the child crying or the child screaming and showing signs of anger that are going to pull the attachment figure closer to them. In a lot of ways, you can think of this as uh, negative reinforcement from a behavioral perspective. It's almost as if the child is knowingly saying, if you want this noise to go away, come take care of me. Pick me up, play with me, feed me, etc. And so the attachment figures over time become quite literally conditioned to respond quickly when the child cries so that that sound goes away and that, there can be a moment of peace again, however long that lasts. Third of these three attachment behaviors I'd like to highlight is that the child eventually, not too long after birth, shows signs of emerging locomotive capacities. Again, sort of a excessively fancy way of saying the child slowly learns how to move their own body. They start scooting around and crawling, and they then learn how to, hold themselves up while holding onto surfaces, and they start scooting towards their attachment figures. And then approximately around 12 months of life, hopefully, assuming development is going relatively well, they start to be able to walk. Now, what's lovely about this is that this is considered an attachment behavior because, in a lot of ways, it is the beginning of a much more proactive effort on the child's part to seek out the attachment figure, right? Their efforts to attract them basically communicate to attachment figures, you come pick me up, come get me, right? The noxious noises that they make, kind of the same thing. they're lying in their crib or wherever, and it's their way of saying, wherever you are in the apartment or the house or wherever, come find me, right? Come to this noise so that you can help me solve this problem. As the child builds their locomotive capacities. It's the beginning of them being a little bit more proactive and saying, I don't like how long I've been apart from my attention figure. I don't like how far away they are. I'm going to get involved and help solve this problem by literally moving closer to the person that is my attachment figure. Okay, so there are two additional things that we need to talk about really quickly, just so that we have a base level understanding of what attachment theory is. And then I'll talk, of course, about how all of this relates to loss, grief, and mourning. One thing that we need to understand is that, okay, these attachment behaviors all contribute to something called the attachment system. And it's important for us to begin to wrestle with the idea that the attachment system is malleable. It can change in a variety of ways based on the relational experiences that the child has early in life in their most formative years. So there's a reason why we all know people in our lives or may have worked with certain clients over the years whose attachment behaviors seem to be downregulated. They don't put a lot of energy into attracting other people, right? They're not confident. They don't sell themselves. They don't smile when appropriately. They don't flirt in various ways. Similarly, those people may also be the kind of people who perhaps don't create enough noxious stimuli. They don't express their emotions enough. They don't talk about when they're feeling upset. These are the clients we work with who seem to be a little upset. And then we ask them, how does that make you feel? And they look at us in earnest. They shrug their shoulders and they say, I'm fine. They may very well be fine sometimes, but what we might be seeing in that moment is that some experience early in life resulted in that attachment behavior being sort of muzzled and downregulated. Similarly, those individuals may also be the kind of people who don't use their locomotive capacities very often to seek out other people. They're perhaps a little too content spending the weekend by themselves. They don't call others when they're upset. They're not likely to initiate plans to spend time with others. They're sometimes a little too content withdrawing, spending time by themselves, and not going out of their house to do the equivalent of a child walking across the house to find an attachment figure. They're not mobilizing their body to go be near people as often as what would be good for them. Now, take that whole idea that I'm talking about and invert the whole thing, because it is also true that there are other individuals, unfortunately, whose attachment system seems to have been upregulated and magnified. They flirt a little too much. They are a little too focused on attracting other people. And similarly, these might be the kind of clients we work with who are very quick to express anger. They are expressing intense and painful emotions quite often, almost too often sometimes. And unlike the person who doesn't use their locomotive capacities to seek out other people as much as what would be good for them, some people struggle with the opposite. They have such a hard time being by themselves for an appropriate stretch of time. They're sort of always on the phone with somebody. They're always seeking out the company of other people because they have a very difficult time regulating their mood if they are alone for a moment. Okay. The other thing about attachment theory to highlight before moving forward is that separation is the problem. It is the fly in the ointment. It's the thing that dysregulates the attachment system. It evokes fear as we'll talk about later, separation is the thing, especially for young children, that inhibits exploration and activates something that John Bowlby aptly named protest. Attachment behaviors are much more likely to emerge when there is an amount of separation that the child is uncomfortable with. And so all these attachment behaviors emerge as a way of the child protesting. The child is saying, I do not like how far apart we are. The child is saying, you and I haven't cuddled for a certain amount of time and I don't like it. So that's why I'm crying. That's why I'm angry. That's why I'm going to crawl or walk around the house until I find you and interrupt whatever it is that you're doing. Okay, that's the sort of basis of attachment theory that we're going to build upon when talking about how it is that attachment theory proves to be incredibly relevant to the experience of loss, grief, and mourning after an attachment figure dies. Okay, so in a lot of ways, you could argue that it was John Bowlby's singular genius to see a parallel between the child's intuitive reaction to separation and the experience of loss as a result of an attachment figure dying. Just as separation activates the attachment system and those acts of protest, John Bowlby and other attachment theorists continue to observe that outright loss reactivates the attachment system all the same. So this provides us a nice sort of theoretical basis for why it is that our bereaved clients are crying. Why is it that they're angry? Well, it's in part because of some inborn instinct that tells them when I'm apart from the people that I am usually closest to, I don't want to accept this. And I want to signal to the world around me that I don't like this and I want this to stop. In a lot of ways, it provides a real nice sort of basis for empathy. It's a lot of my clients feel very heard when I say something to them to the effect of, you're very upset because you do not like what's going on and you wish that somebody would help you to make it so that your loved one could come back again. Even when you think about that third attachment behavior that I talked about, emerging locomotive capacities, that connects to something that a lot of attachment theorists refer to quite simply as searching behaviors. Because here too, loss reactivates that part of the attachment system, and it helps us to really understand some of the more peculiar expressions of mourning that we hear about from some of our clients. I've heard endless examples over the years of how, our clients will pick up their phones and sort of go through the motions of calling the person that died. It's almost like their instinct is saying, just go look for them a little harder. Look for them in all the ways that you used to be able to find them. Maybe they'll be there. Um, I've talked to a lot of clients over the years who find themselves doing things like they're just, for reasons they don't even really understand, they're driving by their parents' house, even though they died 6 months ago. They don't have any intention to go in. They don't even really know why they decided to drive by. It just feels like some instinct is telling them, go to the place where that person could always reliably be found. I've even heard some really interesting examples over the years of people doing things like walking by the site of an accident that unfortunately was the location of somebody's death. It's almost like there's some unconscious instinct that's telling them, maybe you should go look a little harder for them and you might find them. Okay. Now, part of what's so interesting and fascinating about all of this from a theoretical perspective is that attachment theory tells us all of these attachment behaviors are relatively normative early on, albeit disorganized, right? We see a resurgence of behaviors that were usually functional. It often helped the child to be cute and to express their sadness and their anger and to use their locomotive capacities to go find their attachment figure. So it's normal that these attachment behaviors reemerge in mourning. They are disorganized nonetheless because they aren't helping them to achieve the same kind of outcome as before. From the perspective of developmental psychology, it makes sense to work with to wrap our heads around the idea that, yeah, the working assumption in the acute state of grief is that our losses are retrievable. That's what our attachment behaviors are there to do. They're they're all working under the assumption that loss is just a problem to be solved. If only we cry harder, and if only we look harder for the people that we are separate from. And so, in so many ways, loss and death are total insults to our instincts that usually help us and that usually reflect some kind of healthy psychological development. A lot of us have heard about really basic concepts like object permanence, right? Um, I'll, you know, if my coffee mug is out of my field of perception, it makes sense for me to work with the assumption it's here somewhere. I just have to go find it. For the same reason that a child might not be able to see the ball that you were just playing with, but their instinct tells them I should lift the carpet or I should look around the corner to try to find it. Well, obviously, when any of us are dealing with a loss, that instinct to just look a little harder for someone or something that isn't there, it betrays us and it makes the mourning process very confusing. Similar kind of developmental psychology idea. This idea that from Jean Piaget that we all learned about conservation and specifically reversibility. The idea that a relatively young child understands that an ice cube in a solid form that melts into a state of liquid, well, that whole process can be reversed. Here, too, it's really heartbreaking to hear that some children start to wrap their head around the idea that grandma has died. But then they'll ask, in all honesty, when is she coming back? Even us perfectly intelligent and well developed adults will have moments in the acute stages of grief where we feel like maybe I need to look harder for them, or maybe they will come back eventually. All this said, if you go all the way back to good old Sigmund Freud back in 1917, when he wrote a very seminal paper on loss and grief and mourning called Mourning and Melancholia, even he was observing over 100 years ago that for the vast majority of people who are in a state of mourning, reality eventually wins the day. We Our efforts to reclaim proximity to our attachment figures fail. Reality sets in. The harsh reality is staring us in the face that they're not going to be where we usually found them. And so we terminate that searching process. Um, a whole other behavioral concept I'll throw at you really quick and then we'll move on. I love how this connects to the behavioral concept of what's called extinction bursts and behavioral extinction. And my favorite example of this is ask yourself, what do you do when you lose your keys? What you usually do is you look in the place that they usually are, right? But do you stop doing that after one time? No. You look around the house, but then you look again in the coat pocket they usually are. And then you look in the coat pocket a third time, a fourth time, and a fifth time before it finally settles in. You've lost your keys and you have no idea where they are. Something similar plays out in the mourning process, where there is an increase, what's called an extinction burst, an increase in a behavior that usually worked, before that behavior extinguishes itself. Okay, so seems simple enough, right? The attachment behaviors reemerge until reality sets in, and then, people accept the reality of their loss. Well, what we need to consider is that for the same reason that the attachment system as a whole is malleable based on the relational experiences that the child has early in life, so too are the innate processes of mourning. And so for some individuals in a state of mourning, the attachment system sort of remains hyperactivated for too long. Mourning goes awry because the whole process remains disorganized for too long. And as I'll talk about later, for some individuals, complications emerge because the attachment system remains downregulated throughout mourning. They aren't crying, they aren't expressing anger, they aren't in any way, shape, or form searching for the person they lost. And that's why, in a quieter way, for those individuals as well, the mourning experience can remain disorganized for too long. Okay, so checking on my time. It looks like we're doing good.
And we did
Um,
have a couple questions related to attachment, Paul, if you want to answer them
sure.
now before we move on.
Yeah, I'll take one or
Um,
two questions right now.
yeah, two questions. So the first one I think was when you were on the previous slide and you were talking about the reactivation of attachment and searching. And Dr. Scott asked, could this happen when a male grows up without a father and attaches to gang members?
That's a really lovely example of this kind of thing. Um, I mean, the short answer is yes. And it gets into this whole topic that I'm tempted to talk about for a long time, but I'll have to be brief about it. Sometimes one version of a complicated reaction to loss, and this actually connects a lot to the idea I'm about to talk about called continuing bonds theory. Sometimes what happens is that the bereaved will seek out substitutes,
Mhm.
right? So whether we're talking about something like having never had a father or having lost a father early in life, yeah, it's a good point. Sometimes what people do is rather than truly mourn the loss of an attachment figure, their instincts basically tell them, let's just go find somebody else to fill that role.
Mm,
So another quick example to validate the question that you asked, Dr. Scott. Um, there are times where people lose a spouse, and it is not healthy and encouraging when they just sort of shrug their shoulders and are like, "Well, I'm going to go date again," and then they get married 4 months later. It often has that quality about it, like, did you really mourn your loss, or did you just go find somebody to sort of stand in their stead?
mhm.
So it's a very good question. I could see how, yeah, it might relate to things like uh, dating people who are sort of inappropriate for your age if you have a bad relationship with your mother or father, or like you're talking about seeking out affiliations with gang members. Yeah, great
Mhm.
question.
Great, thank you. Okay, so and then now another question has popped in. So I don't know how many you want to take before you keep going, but
Let's take
um,
one more and then I'll stop in like 20 minutes and take a few
perfect.
more.
Perfect. The next question from Lydia asks, what does this look like if the attachment with the person who passed is a disorganized attachment?
To be completely honest, that is a totally different topic for a totally different presentation. It's a huge topic. You're right to wonder about that because I think the statistics say 95% of people who develop a disorganized attachment style develop that attachment style because of an outright traumatic relationship with their primary attachment figures. And so that opens up this big conversation about the psychology of trauma, what that looks like in relationships, and how that creates its own problems with mourning. I'm not kidding. Email me if you want to talk about that later. That literally is a 2 or 3 hour conversation on its own, but you're right to wonder about that. Um, I am talking today about loss that is gut-wrenching, but I am not talking today about loss that is related to some kind of traumatic bond with an attachment figure.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. And we'll save the other question for a little bit down the road.
Okay, great. Yeah, I
Great.
just want to make sure we stay on
Yeah,
time. But thank
thank
you
you.
for the questions. Please keep them coming. I'd rather do this than just talk into the void for 2 hours. So thank you. Okay, so hey, let's jump into the second of three theories that we're going to talk about, just to again lay the sort of theoretical foundation for all of this. Um, a slightly more recent theory that has emerged over the last, let's call it 3 decades, is what's referred to as continuing bonds theory. And it's rooted in the observation that it is rarely the case that individuals who process their loss in a healthy way fully sort of relinquish any meaningful tie to the person that they lost. That's the observation, right? There is not much that suggests the only way that you can process a loss in a healthy way is to just completely cleave off any meaningful connection or tie to the attachment figure that you lost. So speaking of Freud and all things psychoanalytic, there's this old concept, this sort of psychoanalytic parlance called decathection or decathexis. Sorry. The idea being to decathect is to take the energy you had once invested in a relationship and sort of take it back and invest that energy elsewhere now that the relationship is gone. Well-intended theoretical idea from over 100 years ago. But again, all clinical observations, or at least the vast majority of them, say healthy bereaved individuals don't do that. They often maintain some kind of meaningful tie and they are healthy. So it's part of the reason why I love this little caption that I found online, right? It is normal and healthy for a bereaved individual to do things like talk to a picture of their deceased loved one. Okay. All that said, we need to also acknowledge that there are clearly some bereaved individuals who hold on to the ties that they had to their loved ones a little too much. Time seems to stop in its tracks, and they remain a little too tethered to the relationship they once had with the person who is now deceased. So, how do we reconcile these two observations? Well, continuing bonds theory offers the following conceptualization of what healthy bereavement looks like. From the perspective of continuing bonds, healthy bereavement involves an enduring connection that becomes a secure internal mental representation of the deceased. And in this way, that once disorganized attachment system becomes reorganized. The attachment schemas, if you will, those, those implicit beliefs that are telling the child, make noxious noises so that the attachment figure comes near. Be cute and playful so that they pick us up. Go seek them out if they aren't within earshot and we need to go find them. Well, those attachment schemas need to accommodate the external reality that the attachment figure is no longer in the world in the form that they had once assumed. Where the child once sought out the external attachment figure, they now seek out something more internal, something that is more of a symbolic representation of the deceased. And the what seems paradoxical about this is the most moving and interesting part of this notion. It's the idea that that symbolic representation is both appreciated as a mere memory of the person who is literally no longer there. But nonetheless, that symbolic representation feels real. And what's so lovely about those times where the bereaved will have imaginary conversations with the deceased, or moments where they feel like they're cooking a meal that their grandmother taught them how to cook, but they sort of feel as if she's still standing by them, reminding them which ingredients to add at what times. They know that person isn't there, but it feels real and it continues to meet attachment needs. That's part of what's so fascinating about this theory. That person derives some semblance of comfort that's similar to the ways that they derived some comfort from literally hearing that person's voice on the other end of the phone, or the sense of comfort that a child gets from an attachment figure giving them a hug. So it seems paradoxical, but yeah, the idea that we're working with here is positive and healthy continuing bonds amount to the bereaved holding on while simultaneously letting go. Okay. Um, so yeah, let me move on to the third of three theories that we're going to be talking a lot about today. And this is the dual process model of coping with bereavement. Wonderful, very well researched theory that has come out of the Netherlands, primarily from Margaret Strube and all of her colleagues. And there are two really important ideas that we need to talk about so that we understand why the dual process model helps us so much in talking about the differences between healthy bereavement and more complicated courses of bereavement and grief. Okay. First of two big ideas here is that we need to understand that the bereaved are experiencing and very much need to deal with two separate types of stressors. The first are referred to as loss-oriented stressors. Now, in a lot of ways, these are the kind of stressors that probably come to mind immediately when you think about what loss and grief entail and what it feels like for the bereaved. So, loss-oriented stressors involve things like emotional displays of crying, angry yearning for reunion with the deceased, um, those cognitive moments where the bereaved are dwelling on the past, they're rehashing memories, they're thinking about what went wrong, when did they become ill, how did our relationship change, and so forth. And even searching behaviors fall into this category. The way I like to think about loss-oriented stressors is that these are the stressful components of grief that are oriented towards the past and that are oriented specifically towards the deceased individual. Now, those type of stressors are totally different from what are referred to as restoration-oriented stressors, often referred to as secondary losses. These involve situational changes that are the result of the loss of an attachment figure or a loved one in general. So these involve stresses like the loss of income, the loss of community, or certainly for romantic partnerships, the loss of physical intimacy, things that the bereaved individual may have also lost and that pull for some effort to adapt, right? Including things like adapting to new roles and a new sense of identity. Whereas loss-oriented stressors are about the past and the deceased themselves. Restoration-oriented stressors are those stresses that involve everything about the present and the future following the loss that is going to look different, that's going to feel different, and that the bereaved is likely going to need to adapt to so that they know how to pay the mortgage, so that they can sort of reconfigure how to be involved in their community, One of my favorite examples of this is if you lose a very dear friend that's obviously heart-wrenching, and there's a certain part of your experience that's going to look like loss-oriented stressors. You're going to be upset. You're going to be thinking about the years that you had with that friend. You're going to be sharing stories with other people about them. Well, ask yourself, what if that friend was the only person that also liked watching the Grammys with you? You might need to figure out when the Grammys roll around next year, what are you going to do now that you can no longer watch with that person? Do you want to watch it alone? Do you want to find somebody else to talk with about it? Um, Similarly, what if the friend that you lost is that person in the group? We all probably know this person, and maybe some of us are this person. That person in the group who is the one that initiates the plans and they organize everything. They're the one to say, this band is coming to town. We should go see them. They're the one to say, we should get all of our kids together and play in the park, right? If that person goes, you're not only mourning the loss of them, you're also trying to figure out somebody in this group of friends needs to take the reins and organize social outings now that we can no longer rely upon them. Okay. The second very important component of the dual process model is referred to as confrontation avoidance oscillations. And it stems from the idea that grief and mourning are by no means it is by no means a linear process. We do not grieve and sustain our focus on it until we arrive at some sense of restoration that signals we're done processing this loss. By the way, even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross knew this, and it's unfortunate that people have misunderstood what she said when she wrote On Death and Dying. By no means was she saying you're going to be in a state of denial, then you're going to experience anger, then you're going to go through a phase of bargaining, then you're going to experience depression, and only then will you arrive at acceptance. She literally didn't say that at all. She was saying all five of these stages just represent different experiences of coming to terms with one's mortality. And somebody might be in a phase of acceptance for a moment, but then they'll exhibit some bargaining, or then they'll revert back to denial, and then they'll get angry again, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So almost half a century later, uh, current researchers are confirming what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross actually was saying. We don't grieve in a linear fashion until we're done with it. A better way to understand what the research says about what the bereaved need to do in order to process their grief as well as possible is that, well, the research shows that the bereaved fare better if they deal with one of these stressors at a time while actively avoiding and even outright repressing, or a better way to put it would be suppressing, the other type of stressor until they have time to oscillate and basically do the exact opposite. So here's a quick example. If somebody tragically lost both of their parents in a relatively short amount of time, whether because of an accident or because, both of their elderly parents died near the same time, they're going to have moments where they're processing loss-oriented stress. That's fine. That's healthy. It sort of builds upon attachment theory, right? Do allow yourself to cry, allow yourself to be angry, allow yourself to sort of search, if you will, by going through old memories and going to old places and doing the things that you used to do with your parents. But that is no time to meet with lawyers to finalize their estate. When you're processing loss-oriented stressors, that is no time to meet with realtors to figure out how to sell their home. But the inverse is true. because they're, you know, I meet with clients all the time who lost somebody 8 years ago and they haven't dealt with any of the restoration oriented stressors. They haven't finalized the estate. They haven't sold the parents' home. And so, what this idea of confrontation avoidance oscillation tells us, and what reminds us of, is that there also need to be moments where the bereaved take care of restoration oriented stresses, where they do things like figure out how can we finalize the estate, where they're meeting with realtors to figure out what do we need to do to sell this house. And this part of the theory reminds us when you're dealing with that stress, which is very related to the loss, of course, that is no time to start expressing deep anguish about the loss. That's not the time to derail your focus and look at photo albums. Okay. Now, it's a whole other part of the research on the dual process model that basically says it's not only important to oscillate between these two stressors, it's very important to just take breaks from grief altogether. I can't tell you how many times my bereaved clients have experienced a just huge, uh, just uh, just a huge amount of relief when I, the grief therapist, can tell them from an informed perspective, it's okay if you want to actively take a break from your grief for like a week. It's okay. Get back to it later, but you don't have to sustain your focus on this 24 hours a day in order for you to progress through this. All right. So we are going to take a break in 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'll take some quick questions. But I want to build upon all this theory and help you start to apply it to these cases. And before I do that, I should actually just summarize everything really quick. If we take all three of these theories into consideration, it actually provides a really lovely and concise summary of what healthy bereavement looks like. Attachment theory tells us allow protest to emerge, be upset about the loss, express sadness, express anger in various ways. Allow yourself to search for the bereaved. Tell stories. Go to those old haunts where they used to be. Allow yourself to act on those instincts that tell you pick up the phone and call them. Now, continuing bonds augments that in a lovely way by saying, yes, it's important to do all of that for the sake of accommodating the external reality that the attachment figure is gone. But it's also important to reorganize the attachment schema in a way that allows you to hold on to some kind of symbolic tie to the attachment figure that you lost. And then dual process model comes in and says, yes, so much of that involves loss-oriented stressors. Don't forget, you also need to figure out what to do about these new money problems that have emerged. You also need to figure out how to organize your social calendar now that your spouse, who was the one in the marriage to initiate social outings, is no longer here to do that. All three of those theories fit together really well to provide us a sort of a very whole and overarching perspective about what healthy bereavement looks like. So before I take questions, I'm just going to breeze through these case vignettes really quick, and then we can come back to these throughout the or during the second half of this presentation. Okay, there's a lot here for each of these vignettes, but just try to let it wash over you and ask yourself, is the attachment system upregulated or downregulated? Are there continuing bonds? Maybe too much, maybe too little. And from the perspective of the dual process model, is there that healthy oscillation, or is some part of that whole process missing? Okay, Let me go through Liam first. Liam's wife has been deceased for 14 years. Their 20th wedding anniversary is fast approaching. He speaks of her failing health from a rare autoimmune disease with a matter-of-fact tone. Liam clearly loved his wife. Nevertheless, he decided to pursue what he called a fresh new start after she passed and devoted himself entirely to his business. He jettisoned his wife's possessions and vowed to cease reminiscing about their marriage for fear of being stuck. Liam obscured memories of time spent together in their home beneath coats of neutral colored paint, a far cry from the vibrant purples, greens, and blues that he and his wife preferred when decorating. Despite his best intentions to move forward, Liam's life lacks any real joy or any real zeal. Feelings of unease emerge while alone in his house and confuse him, spurring him to work long days at his office away from his home. Liam, an otherwise intelligent man, is struggling to recall meaningful anecdotes about his wife, though he did talk a little bit about the nature hikes they used to take prior to her illness. With a veneer of acceptance, he shrugs his shoulders and says, "Those times were great, but now they're gone." During his third therapy appointment, Liam expresses frustration with the dull colors of paint in his home. You notice him mimicking the slow and deliberate technique his wife used to paint. He squints his eyes while demonstrating how she used a short handle so she could get her face close to the wall. He has a grin on his face. Okay, so you're probably, having a lot of different associations already to the stuff I've been talking about. If we were in a live room together, I'd ask you guys to raise your hands and whatnot for quick thoughts about what you think is going on with Liam. But here's the quick summary of it, right? Attachment theory tells us Liam seems to be tamping down his shows of protest, right? Um, he talks about his loss in a matter-of-fact tone. In an effort to move on a little too quickly, he seemed to try to bury his emotions. And the most basic psychodynamic theory tells us nothing within the psyche truly goes away. If we try to repress it, it just emerges in a slightly distorted form if we don't express it clearly. Well, that helps us to explain why it is that even 14 years later, Liam feels incredibly uncomfortable at home. He's trying to not feel his emotions, but they are emerging in a complicated and confusing way that isn't gaining clear and healthy expression. Continuing bonds theory tells us there probably is not enough continuing bonds, if any, are there. And not every single bereaved individual needs to maintain some kind of meaningful tie to the people they lose, but it often proves to be helpful. And at the very least, if we're working with Liam, it's something we want to be curious about. Why is it that he doesn't do anything to sort of keep her memory alive? Why is it that he doesn't go on nature hikes? Why is it that he doesn't paint certain parts of the house with colors that, are reminiscent of the time spent with his wife? And I'll talk later about this really interesting phenomenon that shows up for some people where even their memories themselves are sort of lacking. Like for some people, there's such a dearth of continuing bonds that when you ask them, tell me about the relationship you had with your mother, they can't do it. It's almost like their mind has deactivated the memory and they're saying, I'm not even going to go searching for the memory of my attachment figures. I don't want to think about it. I shut that down a long time ago. Last thing about Liam, really quick, from the dual process model perspective, what we're clearly seeing here is an example of somebody who is focused on restoration oriented stress, but he hasn't oscillated away from that as is appropriate to process loss oriented stressors. So, you know what? I'm going to stop there. We'll touch base about the second case vignette when we come back from the break. Let me take a quick moment to just see if anybody has any other questions about continuing bonds or the dual process model, or Laura, if we want to get to that other question that
Yeah.
was sitting there, whatever you guys want to do.
Sounds good. And we are just having some engagement in the chat. I want to appreciate that. Melissa shared that her grandfather keeps her deceased grandmother's sweater in his truck to this day. And that really resonates for me. Um,
Yeah.
the question that we had before was how could this relate to a parent, a mother that has lost her only child, college aged? And this was back when you were before you did the case study.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So, if I'm, excuse me, if I may ask for clarification,
Mhm.
when you ask, how might this apply to that case? Are you talking about everything that I've been talking about so far, or are you talking about attachment theory specifically?
I'm trying to remember when this dropped in, what exactly you were talking about. The person said yes, everything. They just dropped that
Okay.
in.
And Laura, okay, so if you could say the question one more
Sure.
time, that'd help.
How
Thank you.
could this relate to a parent, a mother that has lost her only child, a college-aged child?
I mean, my most immediate thought is basically just that the whole experience is probably going to be a lot more heart-wrenching. It's going to be a
Mhm.
lot more painstaking. Um, but, what attachment theory tells us is that this whole process is not just relevant to children losing their parents. It's not just relevant to, say, uh, an 8-year-old child feeling separated from a parent or outright losing a parent. This is the sort of blueprint for how we mourn losses throughout the entire lifespan. And so, whether we're talking about a 78-year-old individual losing their last parent who lived until they were well into their 90s, or a mother or a father losing a child, what we are likely to see are a lot of the same painstaking processes. It is probably going to take quite a while for that mother to confront the fact that her child is gone. I'm going to speak bluntly about this for a second. She's not only going to be sad, she's probably going to be pissed off. Okay. She's probably going to be angry. There's probably going to be some anger directed towards whatever the cause of the death was. Why didn't the doctors do more? She might shake her hands at the sky and feel angry at God. Why did God do this to me? That process is going to emerge. She might even find herself engaging in a lot of searching behaviors. And here's the weird thing about this theory and an enormous amount of research that backs this up. To a certain extent, we who work with bereaved individuals who are struggling want to encourage that. So you want her to be angry. You want her to express her sadness. You want her to do things like go into your child's bedroom and sit there for a while. Go places where you and your adult child used to spend time together. But we need to be really careful, even with an incredibly painful loss like that, to make sure that that individual also accommodates the reality that they're gone, figures out a way to maintain some kind of meaningful connection to them that doesn't blur the reality, right? And we want to make sure that she is processing loss oriented stressors and making sure to step away from that at times to figure out. And really, I'm going to talk about this right at the end of the presentation today. Sometimes one of the most painful things we can do when working with bereaved individuals, especially if it's a loss like this, is to basically say in so many words, couched in as much empathy and patience as we can muster, you also need to figure out how to adapt to the fact that your life looks totally different now. And if you're not careful, you'll just let her brood on loss oriented stresses. Okay. More to
Yeah.
say as always, but it's a good example of how even with really painful experiences, all of this stuff applies and it should inform a lot of the work that we try to do. Any other questions, Laura, before we take a break?
I had two more, so I am going to encourage us to be a little quick
Sure.
so that we can make sure to let you get through everything.
Yep.
The first one is someone asked how to deal with multiple losses in a short period of time, like less than 10 days. The second question, just to tee it up, is do these theories also apply to grief when the loss experienced is not of a person, but to a material or other type of loss, like losing your independence or losing the life that they thought they would have before an illness?
Right. So, okay, I'll answer these as briefly or as succinctly as I can.
Great.
In terms of experiencing multiple losses, what I would say is first, avoid the temptation to feel like, all right, we got to process one of these losses at a time until it is fully resolved. Don't do that,
Got it.
right? Per this notion that grief is not a linear thing that we do until it's done.
Mhm.
But what you'll want to do is to make sure that there's some clear sense of like, hey, if we're meeting to do therapy and talk about all three of these losses, within 5 to 10 minutes of this appointment, we need to be clear about which loss are we talking about today. Because if you're not careful, they're just going to jump back and forth between what that relationship meant to them and why they feel sad about that one, but they feel kind of relieved about that experience. It's always better, in my experience, to just figure out we'll talk about the second of those three people as soon as next week, if you'd like.
Mm.
Let's figure out which loss we're talking about today. And then in terms of the second question, the short answer is yes. If we're talking about things like loss of identity, loss of a job, retirement, loss of a home, moving to a different city, uh, getting to a point in your life where you realize you can no longer play pickup basketball because you're not 22 years old anymore and your Achilles is going to snap if you do. I'm not, that's a real example from one of my clients. All of these things are going to pull for protest, right?
Mhm.
It's going to be sad. They're going to be angry. They're going to search out opportunities to figure out, like, is this really done? And then they'll need to accommodate the new reality, maybe hold on to some semblance of an ongoing tie to it, right? Like, well, maybe I can no longer play pickup basketball with 22-year-olds anymore, but maybe I can coach, right? That'll allow me to stay connected to that part of my life.
Mhm.
And then to a lesser extent, yeah, the dual process model applies as well. Process the loss about what came and went, and then adapt to your present day circumstances. Really good question.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Okay, I think we're good for a break. I'm thinking maybe we should do 5 minutes instead of 10 to make sure you have enough time at the end.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, everybody, we're going to keep you on your toes. It's 10:08. Let's meet back here at 10:13.
Okay. Sounds
Let's
good. See
do
you
it.
guys in 5 minutes.
Thanks so much. All right, 10:13. Welcome back, everyone. And we will kick it right back over to you, Dr. Martin. But I would like to just say that we have a couple of folks in the chat appreciating expressing appreciation for this topic and for your presentation. So
Oh, I'm
just
so
want to
happy
share
to
that
hear
with you.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah. Hopefully I keep it going for the second half, but
there you go.
yeah, glad to hear it's appreciated thus far. So yeah, let's jump right back in after our brief break, and let's just kind of continue what I was talking about with the first case vignette by looking at a totally different case vignette. And for the sake of time, I'm going to clue you in to what you're probably going to pick up on really quick anyways, which is that Nia, in a lot of ways, represents almost the exact opposite of this case study of Liam. Okay. Nia's husband, Sam, died 10 months ago from brain cancer. They enjoyed a good marriage and had two daughters, ages 11 and 7, at the time of Sam's death. She describes her educated, successful, and worldly husband as larger than life. Nia cries often since her husband died and spends multiple hours a day at the burial site. She and her daughters have become disconnected from their community despite others' invitations to schedule play dates with friends from school and attend neighborhood events together. She is bracing herself for the anniversary of Sam's death and doesn't know how to handle that day, saying, I just need a place to express everything I'm feeling. Nia reveals that the family home is preserved exactly as it was since Sam's passing. The two children continue to share a small bedroom while Sam's office has been left undisturbed. His books and items associated with numerous hobbies remain strewn about in their usual spaces, including a closet jammed full of his clothes. Nia puts up her hands and gestures as if trying to bat away something near her face. She briefly mentions that the daily sight of his clothes only makes her sad. Okay, so in contrast to the kind of complicated course of bereavement that Liam is showing us, Nia is showing almost the exact opposite in a lot of ways. Whereas Liam's attachment behaviors seemed to be downregulated in his experience of grief and mourning, for Nia, they are arguably upregulated. That protest is persistent and unrelenting. So we obviously don't want to pathologize it if a bereaved individual is experiencing distressing emotions. But we want to start to be curious if they say things like, I cry every single day. I'm crying all day. And if they start to tell us things like, I spend multiple hours a day at the burial site every single day. As somebody who, thinks about attachment theory a lot, where my mind would go with that in an effort to conceptualize what was going on is that's a searching behavior. It's the same instinct that tells a child, go look for mom or dad. Something about Nia's experience is telling her, go to the gravesite every day. Okay. From the perspective of continuing bonds, we have some reason to be a little concerned that continuing bonds are a little too present. She is perhaps remaining a little bit too tied to her bond with her husband. And so again, this is a really nuanced thing we need to figure out. Where do we draw a line between a healthy ongoing tie to the deceased and something that gets in the way of life moving forward? So that her high level of continuing bonds may play some role in the reasons why she and her daughters aren't figuring out how to get connected to the community. They're not spending time with other people in their neighborhood. She doesn't seem to be spending time talking with other people or doing anything other than mourning her loss. There is a low amount of restoration-oriented stress, right? Liam was experiencing loss-oriented stress, but wasn't oscillating to that other kind of stress, and vice versa. Nia is a good example of somebody who, I hope I didn't misspeak there. Liam was focusing too much on restoration-oriented stress, whereas Nia is focusing disproportionately on loss-oriented stress. Okay, so let's keep them in mind. We'll come back one more time to talk about them and apply some other ideas to our understanding of those cases. But let's go ahead and sort of switch into a separate conversation about attachment styles and how that proves to be relevant to all of this. Before we talk about what insecure attachment is and all of the reasons why having an insecure attachment style proves to be a risk factor when dealing with loss, let's take a step back and talk about what secure attachment is in the first place and how it actually represents a protective factor when mourning losses throughout life. And one of the best ways to sort of exemplify what secure attachment is to look at a well-known and well-researched research protocol that a lot of you have probably heard about at this point, called the strange situation paradigm. There are many nuanced aspects to this research, many different steps that need to play out in order for the developmental psychologists to gather all the information that they need to. I'm going to focus on three key moments in this research that really highlight something important about what an attachment style is. And to get the conversation started, what secure attachment system quite literally looks and sounds like. Okay, here's the basic idea for any of you who aren't aware of this, or for those who have heard about it, but for whom it's been a long time since you've heard about this one. The idea is that developmental psychologists will invite a primary caregiver, often a mother, but not always, and their young child, somewhere between the ages of 18 to 36 months old. They'll invite that dyad to come do some research, and they tell the mother ahead of time, here's what's going to go on. We're going to stand on one side of a two-way mirror, and we're going to have you and your child go into the room on the other side of that mirror, and we're just going to watch you guys interact. But at different moments, we're going to signal to you by knocking on the wall to leave the room. And then after about 2 or 3 minutes, we're going to tell you to go back into the room. Okay? So here are the three parts of this research that I really want to highlight. The first is that the caregiver, the primary attachment figure, and their child enter the room. And among other things, the researchers are looking at whether or not the child ever breaks away from their attachment figure to go explore the various toys that are strewn about in the room. Theoretically, what they're looking at is there an attachment that results in that caregiver being treated as a safe base, somebody whom the child can return to for comfort and care, to sort of refuel themselves so that they can once again break away and go explore this novel environment. Then the second point that I want to, or the second moment I want to highlight, is that the psychologists do what they said they were going to do. They knock on the wall, and that signals to the caregiver, leave the room and come with us on the other side of the mirror for a while. At this point, what they are observing is the child's emotional reaction to separation. After a few minutes, the caregiver or the primary attachment figure returns, and then there's another crucial moment that the psychologists are looking at. What happens to the child and the caregiver when they reunite? Okay, so here are the big takeaways when talking about secure attachment. What do we see with a child who is deemed to have a secure attachment? Okay, first of all, the securely attached child does explore their novel surroundings. It doesn't mean that they're hyper independent. It just means that they hang out with mom for a little bit, then they go play with a toy by themselves for 3 minutes, then they go back and show mom the toy, or they get a hug, and then they go play with some of the toys again. That's indicative of a secure attachment. The second part of this is crucial, and it sometimes is misunderstood, to be honest, especially in Western societies and cultures that prize independence a little too much. The securely attached child gets upset when separated from their attachment figure. It doesn't mean they're insecure if they start crying. It doesn't mean that they're insecure if we literally see the kid crawl or walk towards the door that the mother left out of. That tells us that's a healthy attachment response. We're supposed to be upset when our attachment figures are separated from us, especially in novel situations, right? This child is confused about their novel surroundings, and it's scary to them to all of a sudden realize mom or dad isn't here. Third, when the caregiver does return to the room and when they do reunite, the securely attached child is soothed by the reunion and by that connection. Okay, so part of what's so fascinating about the strange situation paradigm and the massive amounts of research that have been done over decade after decade is that all of these overt behaviors that the psychologist can literally see through the two-way mirror. By the way, fun fact, it's also called a one-way mirror sometimes. I don't know why it's called both, but anyways. Um, Part of what's so interesting about all of this is that all of these overt behaviors correspond in some meaningful way to something more internal in the child. What John Bowlby coined the internal working model, which is the idea that overt attachment behaviors provide some commentary on the more internal and implicit beliefs that we all carry around about two big things, okay? The first idea is, what is your appraisal of your own attachment needs? Okay? What do you think of the fact that you have a certain reaction to being separated from those that you love and care about? Okay? Secondly, what is your appraisal of the other person's availability? So for the child with a secure attachment, they have a positive appraisal of their own attachment needs, which is part of the reason why they express their emotions. Makes sense, right? On some level, the child is saying, you, my attachment figure, are too far away from me than what I'm comfortable with. I like when you are nearby. I have no reservations about letting you know that I don't like this. And there comes the protest, right? It's essentially the child's way of saying, I want you nearby, and it's totally fine that I'm upset about this. Secondly, what we see in individuals with a secure attachment, including these children in the strained situation paradigm, is that essentially they have a hopeful appraisal of the other's availability. They are crying and moving towards the door because they essentially believe this is going to work, right? Like my attachment behaviors are going to result in my attachment figures resuming proximity with me, even on an internal level. As I'll talk about in just a little bit, we see this play out. The individual with a secure attachment style not only feels comfortable, I'll use this prop one more time, they not only feel comfortable being like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to call my friend. That's okay that I want to talk to my friend who I haven't spoken with in a month. They also feel like in the internal space of their mind, like, you know what? I'm going to conjure up a memory of my grandmother. I'm going to seek her out in that way. Because I not only feel good about the fact that I like thinking about the people in my life, I also trust that seeking them out is going to help me, right? So they feel comfortable telling stories about the people they lost. Okay, how does all of this apply to something that goes well beyond just, being separated from a mother or father for 3 minutes in the strange situation paradigm? It provides an enormous amount of commentary on what individuals with a secure attachment style are likely going to experience when they lose people later in life. And the research is pretty crystal clear about this, and it's very consistent. For the most part, having a secure attachment style is protective in and of itself. It tends to result in these individuals experiencing a relatively healthy course of grief and just of the whole mourning process. Why? Quite simply because those attachment behaviors emerge as they are designed to. These are the kind of people who come into therapy, they express their emotions openly, and might be after 11 appointments, they tell you, in all honesty, this helped so much. I don't know if I need to schedule any more appointments, or they might say, like, tell you what, let's start scaling back the appointments. I'm doing better. They are, because they're expressing their emotions in a healthy way. Plus, research also finds, to no surprise, these individuals seem to have a easier time erecting continuing bonds. They're comfortable with the idea that, you know what, I'm aware that that person isn't here like they used to be, and I am very comfortable acting on my attachment needs by maintaining some kind of meaningful connection to that partner or that friend or that family member who I lost. And it tends to bode well for them to have that meaningful, symbolic connection. Similarly, research also shows that individuals with a secure attachment style tend to do everything that the dual process model advises. They tend to oscillate between both loss and restoration oriented stressors. I've always found this really interesting that you can sort of connect this idea back to the strange situation paradigm. For the same reason that the child will openly express protest and emotional distress during separation, well, later in life, that same individual will allow themselves to process loss-oriented stressors, right? Like, okay, that person's gone. I'm upset. I'm inclined to tell stories and go revisit places we used to spend time together. Guess what else they're able to do? Individuals with a secure attachment style are also able to do the equivalent of the child exploring their novel surroundings. That fascinates me. These are the same individuals who can essentially say there is a time to turn to the past for some degree of emotional refueling. There is also time to do the equivalent of explore my novel environment and play with new toys. They are literally doing, not literally, but they're essentially doing the same thing by saying, I guess I have to adapt to a new life that doesn't involve my best friend who also liked watching the Grammys with me. They go explore everything novel about life after their loss. Okay. So the research is crystal clear. I almost always get some question about this saying, well, is it really true that a child's behaviors at age 20 months persists in their personality? I hate to say it, guys. The answer is yes. The research is so clear on this. The attachment style that emerges in the first 2 to 3 years of life almost always, not 100% of the time, but it almost always is predictive of the kind of relationships that that person is going to have when they grow up and the ways in which they process separation and loss. Okay. I have two more PowerPoint slides. I'm going to go through these and then we will have a good chunk of time to field any more questions, just talk about all of this in general. All right. So now that we've talked about what secure attachment, what a secure attachment style is, and the role that it plays in loss and grief and the mourning process, let's talk a little bit about two different types of insecure attachment. And by the way, like, in line with that question that somebody asked earlier, there is a fourth type of attachment style called disorganized attachment. We're not talking about that today. That's a whole separate conversation about outright trauma. Okay. Let's talk about what is often called insecure avoidant attachment, which is also known as a dismissive attachment style. But for today, we're primarily going to talk about it as insecure avoidant. Okay. And here too, we're gonna talk about it first from the perspective of the strange situation paradigm and what developmental psychologists observe when they're looking through the two-way mirror when that child has an avoidant attachment style. Okay. So again, let's return to those three key moments. What do we see? First of all, some children are certainly exploring all that is novel about the room that they enter into with their caregiver. But what we see with some kids is that there's a high amount of exploration, right? They don't seem to spend a lot of time connected to their attachment figure. They're bent on exploring the environment independently away from their attachment figure. Okay, not the worst thing in the world, but it pairs with other observations that together give us reason to be concerned. Okay, so then there comes that moment once again where the psychologist knock on the wall, signaling to the caregiver, please leave the room for a few minutes, like we discussed. And here's the interesting thing about some kids. For some kids, they do not have any emotional reaction at all to this moment of separation. And again, you got to be really careful about how you interpret this. This is not strength. This is not, independence that, that the parents should feel proud of. What this suggests, unfortunately, is that the attachment system is being down regulated. Okay. And I'll talk in just a minute, quite literally, about why that's so concerning. Okay. So some children exhibit a high amount of exploration. Then, when separated from their attachment figures, they exhibit a sort of down-regulated affective response. And then the attachment figure returns to the room and the child is indifferent. It's almost like separation and reunion register as this non-event. It doesn't matter to them. They didn't get upset and they kind of don't care that mom just came back to the room. Here's the heartbreaking thing that we need to understand about this pattern of behaviors. What is almost always the case with children who exhibit an avoidant attachment style is that at face value, they're cool, calm, and collected. But there's actually a bevy of medical research that shows children with an avoidant attachment style, they do not overtly express stress, but their physiology remains distressed. I've given this presentation so many times, and it breaks my heart every time I say this. The research tells us their cortisol levels are through the roof. Their heart rate is abnormally high. But what they've learned is if I express protest, nothing happens. That's what went wrong in their early attachment experiences. Interestingly enough, it's a matter of extremes with these kids. Either they cried and nobody picked them up, or somebody was always picking them up, interestingly enough. Okay. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. But the main idea here is that these children become the way they are because on some level, attachment behaviors and the attachment system as a whole just registers as learned helplessness. They just learn nothing happens when I seek out caregivers. If I cry or get angry, they don't come take care of me as quickly as they should. They kind of just let me cry it out. So apparently I shouldn't get upset, but they remain physiologically distressed. And the medical research tells us these children quite literally get sick more often because the solution should be our base level evolutionary acquired instincts to be with an attachment figure. That solution doesn't happen. And then cortisol levels remain high, heart rate remains elevated, and the child remains in a protracted state of stress and quite literally a protracted state of inflammation. Okay. What do these overt behaviors have to say about the internal working model and their implicit beliefs? Well, first of all, these individuals often adapt or adopt a sort of pseudo self-sufficiency about themselves. They move forward with life with this air of hyper independence, right? So much so that they almost find it uncomfortable to be close with others. They don't trust that it's good to rely upon others, right? So, yeah, the internal working model is potentially problematic for two different reasons. They conclude that their needs for attachment suggest something about them that's kind of weak. And in terms of the response they expect to get from others, they've learned to expect, you know what, people probably find it annoying when I am lonely or when I'm sad. And these are the clients that we all have who need to work through this issue where they start to realize whenever I'm upset, I do not call my friends. And then my friends are telling me, you should call me. I'd be happy to be here for you if you need it. Those individuals with a insecure avoidant attachment style often need to work through a lot of internal resistance to the idea that it feels very scary to need other people. If you administer something called an adult attachment interview, what you'll find is that these individuals, again, of completely sound mind, seem to have an absence of thoughts about the deceased. You'll ask them, tell me about the relationship you had with your mom and dad when you were a kid. And again, they're not trying to lie. They're being honest with you when they say, I don't have a lot of memories of those years, or their memories are kind of vague and devoid of emotional salience. Okay. For reasons similar to why Liam is being honest when he says, I don't have a lot of clear memories about the kind of stuff that my wife and I did together. So, how does this all play out in terms of loss and grief and mourning? Well, individuals who have an insecure avoiding attachment style, they tend to experience a delayed or a masked course of grief. These are the people that call me that say, my son died 8 years ago, and it's starting to dawn on me. I don't think I ever really processed my feelings. These are the individuals, kind of like Liam, who experienced what we might call masked grief. They're not resonating on a conscious level with their thoughts and their feelings of grief, but they show up in weird physiological symptoms, right? Liam isn't saying, I feel anxious in my home because I'm reminded of my deceased wife. He's just saying, I don't know why. I just feel these odd sensations of anxiety when I'm at my house. I think that's the reason why I'm working compulsively. I think that's the reason why I spend too much time away from my house in my office. So, in other words, some individuals struggle with grief because their appropriately negative emotions have been minimized. They've been deactivated and downregulated. In terms of continuing bonds, they may struggle in part because their internal working model tells them don't remain connected to the memory of who you lost. It's not going to help. Just cleave it off and move forward. And in terms of what the dual process model tells us, these are the kind of individuals like Liam who privilege restoration oriented stressors a little too much because to them that feels like look at me, I'm adapting, I'm moving on, I'm getting on with life. Fine, there's some value in that, but again, the dual process model reminds us that needs to be balanced out with moments that are more oriented towards the past and that allow for those attachment behaviors to emerge so that the bereaved can allow themselves healthy emotional expression. All that said, treatment planning and treatment goals for these individuals, in my opinion, it's kind of straightforward, right? Individuals like Liam would benefit from more emotional expression. So, hey, big surprise, right? Us therapists are going to work with people like Liam and try to sort of pull it out of him, right? Like, say more about that, Liam. Tell me more about your wife. How does that make you feel? What do you feel in your body when you talk about this, right? We're also going to encourage him to, and people like him, to reminisce a little bit more, share stories about the relationship that they lost. We might even want to encourage individuals like Liam, including those who have an avoidant attachment style, to do things like maybe put a little bit of energy into figuring out what kind of meaningful connection you want to have. Are there certain things you want to do during your wedding anniversary every year? Do you want to paint the house the way that she used to? I noticed you smiling when you were, mimicking the way that your wife used to paint. Maybe it would make you happy to do that kind of thing, right? Those kind of interventions often prove to be very meaningful for my bereaved clients like Liam who don't have enough continuing bonds. And again, the dual process model tells us these individuals need to be encouraged to step away from adaptation and adjusting to what's different about life after loss, and to maybe give a little bit more focus on the past. Now, again, I'm going to say this one more time. For these individuals, it's kind of intuitive, right? Big surprise. Paul Martin is telling you to encourage your clients to express their emotions. Of course. Just buckle up for the fact that these individuals are often going to be very resistant to this. They are in many ways going to try to dodge this. They're going to talk about their emotions for 30 seconds, but then go right back to talking about how to adapt. And you want to try to do what you can to encourage them to give a little bit more time and energy towards expanded emotional expression, more loss-oriented stress, and maybe more continuing bonds. And all of this other stuff we're talking about just provides us a nice theoretical framework to understand why this person might be the way they are, what it is about their upbringing that may have resulted in them struggling the way they are. Okay, all that said, let's move on to the last major PowerPoint slide of this whole presentation. And I'm going to talk now about a totally different type of insecure attachment style referred to as insecure ambivalent, otherwise known as a preoccupied attachment style. But again, I'm going to talk about it more in terms of an insecure ambivalent attachment style. Some developmental psychologists who are doing the strained situation paradigm observe a totally different sequence of behaviors that correspond to a whole different type of sort of characteristic problems with emotional regulation, relational satisfaction, and management of grief throughout life. Okay, what do we see when some children come into the room with the toys? They don't explore the novel environment at all. There's low exploration. They cling to their attachment figure and are a little too focused on making sure that the attachment figure is proximal. Okay. Then that moment comes one last time where the psychologists knock on the wall and the caregiver leaves the room. And at first, the child's emotional reaction of upset seems kind of normal, right? Securely attached children get upset when they're separated. But what some children do suggests that that part of the attachment system is magnified. It's upregulated. It's not enough to just whimper. They are screaming bloody murder. They are banging on the floor. They are punching the door. They are screaming and crying and rolling around on the floor, throwing an absolute fit. And then here's the really telling moment. The attachment figure is told to come back to the room. And an intuition would tell you these children, more than anybody, should be really happy to see their attachment figure and to reunite with them. But what some children do is there's low exploration, upregulated affect, and then that connection that they were preoccupied with doesn't help. The children remain upset. They remain inconsolable. And there's a heartbreaking reason for why that is the case that I'll talk about in just a second. For these children, the overt attachment behaviors that we see correspond to a whole different constellation of implicit beliefs that inform their internal working model. For some individuals, they are constantly worried about being left by other people who they perceive to be as powerful, but not particularly interested in being connected. For them, their mental representations are the opposite of what Liam struggles with. For some people, if you administer an adult attachment interview, what they make clear is that there is sort of continual accessibility of thoughts. They're always thinking about attachment figures. They're always wondering, where is my wife? Where is my husband? What are my friends doing? Who are my friends hanging out with lately? I haven't talked to them in 3 days. Are they mad at me? Maybe I need to call them for reassurance. Or their friend is, out of town 3 hours away, and they're like, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna get in my car and go hang out with them in Milwaukee, right? There's this excessive yearning for proximity, and it never satiates them. The research that we have on why this attachment style emerges for some individuals is that it's very different from the kind of relationship that the insecure avoidant child had. Some children experience not a complete absence of availability, they experience incredible inconsistency. So, mom or dad might be emotionally available at some moments, but at other moments they aren't. And it creates a crisis within the child that leaves them thinking, okay, crying isn't going to cut it. I need to bang my head against the wall. All right. Seeking them out a little bit isn't going to reliably ensure that they're available. I need to monitor them at all times and never let them leave my sight. That's the sort of beginning of what crystallizes into a different kind of attachment style for some individual that leaves them worried. It's not enough to just tell the therapist, I'm sad. I need to curl up into fetal position on the couch and and cry and scream and present in crisis, or else I can't trust that this therapist is going to be interested in actually helping me. That all began for some individuals in the first years of life with their primary attachment figures. How does this play out with all things involving loss and grief and mourning? Well, it probably comes as no surprise that for these individuals, they're very susceptible to a chronic course of grief. The attachment behaviors emerge, but they do not relent. Everything remains disorganized, and all those attachment behaviors are hyperactivated. There's a lot of rumination. We don't see healthy continuing bonds. All we're seeing is that some individuals, including those with an ambivalent attachment style, they do things like they spend all day looking at old photo albums. They spend inordinate amounts of time sitting by a gravesite, expressing sad emotions. They are excessively focused on loss-oriented stresses, and they're having a very difficult time stepping away from that kind of stress and giving some time and energy towards restoration-oriented stress. Okay, here's the last point I'm going to emphasize before I wrap up today. I'm going to go all the way back to Nia. What did Nia say she needs? Right? She's bracing herself for the anniversary of Sam's death and doesn't know how to handle that day, saying, I just need a place to express everything I'm feeling. Here's one of the difficult things that we need to keep in mind when working with individuals like Nia. There are going to be times where we're working with bereaved clients where their instincts tell them, I need more loss-oriented stress. I need more space to express my emotions. And we don't want to outright prevent them from doing that. But for some individuals, part of their treatment plan needs to involve bracketing off some time for loss-oriented stresses in the very therapy session itself, but we need to slowly and steadily nudge them in the direction of making room for restoration-oriented stress as well. We need to help them figure out how to maintain healthy continuing bonds that allow some sense of connection to their loved ones, but a continuing bond that also accommodates the reality of who they lost and allows space for other activities and relationships moving forward in life. They need healthier continuing bonds, slightly less attachment behaviors than what are likely to emerge from them naturally, and more restoration-oriented stress. Don't be surprised if your instincts tell you, I'm being a jerk by telling them to do this. Or wait, did Dr. Martin tell me to not let my bereaved clients express their emotions? That's not the point. It's just that we need to help them practice healthy compartmentalization of those feelings. With the little time that we have left, let me go ahead and hit the brakes, and I will take 20 seconds to shamelessly promote the book that I published about 3 years ago called Personal Grief Rituals. Please consider looking for it online and giving it a read, especially if you found anything that I've been talking about today interesting, including things like attachment theory, um, the psychology of loss, grief, and mourning. And one big topic that wasn't very relevant to today's presentation that I talk about a lot in this book involves different cultural practices of loss, grief, and mourning, just different cultural experiences of grief in and of itself, and the ways in which different individuals that we work with can create their own personalized grief ritual that caters to their individual psychological needs, including their attachment style, and a grief ritual that caters to the specific relationship that they lost, which a cultural grief ritual might not be particularly attuned to. Okay, here is the huge list of small font of scholarly references that informed the presentation. I will be making the attachment slides, that's a slip. I will make these slides available for everybody, especially if you want to look up any of these articles or anything. We do have a few minutes left. If anybody has some quick questions I might be able to answer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. There's lots of appreciation for you in the chat. I think what I'll do is I'll do the wrap up housekeeping right now for anyone who has to hop off. And then if you have a little time, anyone who can stand a little longer, we can do some Q&A. Does that work for you, Dr. Martin?
That certainly works for me.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Okay.
I realize we're kind of coming right up to 11 o'clock. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a beefy topic. So, with regard to the CEUs, just please see the links in the chat for the evaluation and the post-test, both of which must be filled out in order to be eligible for CEUs. In addition to the links that Melissa just dropped in the chat, we will be emailing those links out later today. Both of these things will close in 1 week, a week from today on Friday, February 13th. And unfortunately, we can't give extensions or make exceptions to that requirement. So if you have any questions about CEUs, feel free to get in touch with us through Eventbrite. I want to thank everybody for coming today and thank Dr. Martin. And let's kick it off. I have a long list of questions.
Okay, I got time. So
Great,
yeah, I'm happy
great.
to do what I can do.
Well, let me start with this one. Actually, it has to do with what you mentioned about your book. And there's a little conversation going on in the chat about culture and how much of attachment style is cultural and how does culture play into dealing with grief. So maybe the answers to those questions are in your book.
Yeah, the clever answer is to wink and say, "Go buy my
Feel
book."
right.
You can find out. But no, I'll answer it in short. Okay, so part of what's interesting about the study of attachment theory is that it was very much born out of cross-cultural research. So there is an enormous amount about attachment theory that is not localized to any particular culture.
Mhm.
If you're looking at the mother-child relationship in Madagascar or Poland or Peru, you're going to see a lot of the same behaviors. And you're going to see a lot of the same processes that naturally unfold in the mourning process as well. Okay, now all that said, it's a very interesting question. And yes, I do write about this quite extensively in the book. If you look at different cultures, what you find is that they have starkly different answers to questions that you'd think would be obvious,
Mhm.
including things like what does grief feel like? Not all cultures say that grief feels like sadness. Some cultures say grief is to be expressed through anger. Some cultures say grief is to be experienced as a rather joyful, almost celebration of life. Uh, Another question that I found to be incredibly interesting in my research is that even if you look at different cultures and ask the question, when does death happen? Wildly different answers, right? Our culture, steeped in biological reductionism, will say death happens when neurological activity ceases. Other cultures will say, well, yeah, but hair and nails continue to grow for 10 days. Maybe death doesn't happen until 10 days later. And the most dramatic example of this is some cultures say death hasn't occurred until the body has completely decomposed. And here's what's fascinating about that. The answer to that question provides insight into what different cultures say about how long mourning is supposed to take. So our culture says go to the funeral, get back to work. It's done, right? That's problematic for totally different reasons than the problems that we see in some cultures where they are literally saying the mourning process lasts about 7 to 10 years because until the body is completely decomposed, they're not truly gone. So you're still in a state of mourning. Believe it or not, that's the short answer to the question. It's a really big topic. And yeah, that's the shortest I can be about it.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Um, okay, we had a question when you were talking about secure attachment styles,
Okay.
where someone asked, is this the same for a young person, for an 11-year-old? They shared that my son still wants to sleep with me, and I'm trying to have him sleep in his own bed, and he cries. And so that I think that's their question.
Well, I mean, the short version is if it's specific to sleeping, okay. If it's specific to sleeping, probably doesn't provide an enormous amount of commentary on their character, their emotional regulation, their attachment style. If that child enjoys playing by themselves sometimes, but also enjoys spending time with you. If they go to school and maintain their emotional equilibrium, but then likes coming back home, okay, then this probably isn't commentary on their attachment style. It probably just says something about how hey, who of us doesn't like sleeping next to a warm body on
Mhm.
most nights, especially during the Chicago winter, right? So there's some element of that that could probably be worked on. And, like you could encourage them to tolerate spending a little bit more time in their bed by themselves. But I don't think there's any reason to overinterpret it as being commentary on, them having an insecure attachment style.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Next question.
Yeah.
Any advice for those who are disconnected before a loss, even if just living in different states without conflict, and the regret of not visiting or connecting more?
Okay, it begs the question, like, are we talking about being disconnected because you have a secure attachment with somebody, but they just so happen to live in another country? Or are we talking about an attachment from whom you are estranged,
Yeah. I think
right?
they're referring to the first. I'm also interested in the second.
Okay, the first one is really interesting because um, one thing I always ask my bereaved clients about during the intake, I'm always asking about emotions, of course, and I'm asking, are you sad? Don't want to assume that they are. I always ask, are you angry? I also often ask, is there any part of this that makes you feel happy or relieved? It's okay to talk about that. And the reason why I'm saying all this is because I always ask about a fourth emotion. Are you feeling guilty? And most of the time, I'm not being hyperbolic. 98% of the time, if my bereaved client says, I feel guilty, it is for largely irrational reasons. They didn't do anything wrong. They're not culpable. It's just that that immediately tells you that's something that you and I need to target because irrational guilt contributes to a lot of complicated bereavement.
Mm.
And one of the most common examples is something like, I should have spent more time with them. Unless there's something egregious going on, they deserve compassion about things like you have a busy life. You live in Los Angeles, your family is in Boston, you don't have piles of money to fly back and forth every week. You saw them as often as you could. Let's do what we can to sidestep guilt as quickly as possible. Yeah.
Gotcha. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, when you were talking about the dismissive or avoidant attachment style, someone asked, would this be different or similar to a person who has neurological condition or developmental issues like autism?
The short answer is yes, totally different.
Okay.
Now there's some overlap, right?
Hmm.
But somebody who is not exhibiting the usual attachment behaviors because of some kind of neurodevelopmental disorder, like all things involving autism, that's different from our study of attachment styles that emerge in otherwise healthy children who enter life equipped with healthy attachment behaviors that change based on the less than ideal experiences they have with their attachment figures.
Got it. Thank
Yeah,
you.
they are different. There's some overlap. And I guess I'll just slide in really quick.
Mhm.
One of many factors that plays into attachment style involves temperament. We do all come into life hardwired to some degree to be more or less emotionally reactive, to
Mm.
return to baseline quicker or more slowly. And so there are certain temperamental things that are going to influence attachment behaviors. When we're looking at neurodevelopmental disorders, that certainly is one of those things that is likely just going to result in that child day one not being as inclined to be attached to their attachment figures.
Got it.
Yep.
Okay, so we had a question from Viviana. How do we assist a child process the death of a parent they didn't really have a relationship with?
Um, it's a lot easier to answer that question if we're talking about an adult
Mhm.
but nonetheless, the quickest thing I can say about that is that, assuming the child is old enough to be appropriately verbal and, just aware of the complexity of death in and of itself, um, yeah, part of what you're helping people mourn when they didn't have a satisfactory attachment in the first place is just that. You're not mourning the loss of a dear relationship. You're mourning the opportunity to have developed the kind of relationship you would have liked. Whether we're talking about, a 9-year-old who wishes they could have had that attachment figure with them through the remainder of their childhood, Or you're talking to somebody who's 29 years old and they're mourning the fact that my father isn't going to get to know my children. That's the central focus of the mourning often. The loss of an opportunity to have an attachment that you would have liked, and that is regardless of the age. That is that is often relevant to this feeling that the child or the adolescent or the young adult or whomever had sort of hoped to develop more of an attachment. And then when that person dies, part of the mourning process is coming to terms with the fact that I'd always hoped that my dad and I would get close. Now I have to contend with the fact that we're never going to. And the whole
Mhm.
thing is, of course, just so much more fragile if you're having that conversation with a 6 year old. The last thing I'll say about it is this: for somebody who's 6 or 7 or 8, it is unfortunately going to be a very long process of them realizing, oh, it would have been nice to have that parent around during this phase of my life that I didn't even realize I was going to have to traverse.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think we have to wrap it up now. I apologize to those of you we couldn't get to. I would encourage you actually to send your questions to Dr. Martin. We've
Yeah.
just shared his email in the chat. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. I hope you can tell it's very clear from watching the chat how much people engaged with and appreciated this topic and
Oh,
the
great.
information you shared today. So thanks so much to everyone. Happy Friday, and we'll see y'all soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for all the questions.